Thanks again for your generosity in bringing me here. It's been great. This is actually the beginning of a long, I guess, European tour of architecture schools. So I'm hoping the jet lag. Unfortunately, you're getting me at the most jet lagged. So I hope as the days go on, it wears off a bit. I just arrived yesterday afternoon. So I think in the past 18 months, year and a half, past year, I've been thinking a lot more about not just what I write about, but the fact that I am a writer and that I studied architecture and that I don't know if I would say I studied writing, but I also have degrees that involve practices that involve a lot of writing in architecture history and urbanism. And I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be someone who writes, who's not really an architect in any way. I don't practice architecture, but I write about architecture, obviously. I write about environments, I write about landscapes, I write about many ideas about space as they relate to concepts of nature. But I write in all of these things. And for the past year and a half, I've been thinking more and more about what that means. And if the writing itself that I do can take on a more experimental character, okay, to sort of push myself in terms of imagining what the writing that I can make is or can be, and also trying to find people from history who have also asked similar questions. And so the past year and a half has been one in which I feel like I've had the most amazing insights, speaking personally, into what writing can be and how writing can relate to space and environment. And the last year and a half has been one in which I think many of my friends have thought I've lost my mind with the work I've made, because it's become so outside any kind of known genre of history, theory, or criticism which historians normally operate, and become something entirely different, something, I'm not even sure what word to use to describe it, but lately I've been using the word environmental translations. So that's my new job description. I'm an environmental translator. And I'll try to explain to you what I mean by that. But what I want to begin discussing is a kind of more is a little bit of a prehistory of a kind of experimental approach to writing in architecture itself and urbanism, and then I'll talk a little bit about my own work. Now, all of you are in an academic context here, which means that all of you write, and some of you may have asked the same questions about writing that I've asked, but you all write, so you all have opportunities to think about how writing differs from other forms of representing or drawing space, environment, architecture, cities, landscapes. And I just have to say one thing. I was saying this to Gerald, I don't know how to pronounce your name in German, and it's embarrassing. Okay, and Stefano, about how here I am in Innsbruck, I should have been giving you a lecture about landscape, because you're surrounded by such a spectacular landscape, but we're going to forget about landscape in this room for a bit. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about architecture and writing more generally in a historical context. So I'll just begin with this image, and I don't want to give this image too much meaning, but you're looking at what in contemporary English we call a spread, right? An open double page from Palladio's books on architecture. It's in its original Italian printing with an image of the Villa Alcuni on the right. And I'm not going to talk much about Palladio, but I just want to say that Palladio was one of a figure in the history of architecture who really masterfully related writing and drawing in a kind of image of what architecture in print looks like to us. And I'm just, again, showing this not to talk about Palladio per se, but just to demonstrate a kind of relationship between words and images of buildings that has become very typical and accepted, in which the kind of space of language and the space of the building are more or less kept at a polite distance. There's a few letters in the plan that are keyed to locations in the text so that he can call things out, but it's a very polite relationship. The writing and the representation of buildings as language and the representation of buildings as drawings don't interfere with each other. They're not messy. And many people have thought about language and architecture, right? You've probably read many of these people, such as Adrian Forty, the British architectural historian. He said that writing was one of the four things that make architecture architecture. The others are photographs, the drawings of buildings, and the actual building itself. And he said these four things are what creates the system of architecture. And that without one of them, it's what we call buildings or architecture, the practice of space becomes something else. And other people like Michael Hayes are even more intensely philosophical about the reliance or the connection between architecture and writing, and that Michael Hayes argues that writing is what makes architecture intelligible, that without writing, there's no orientation for a building. We don't have an innate ability to understand space or give words to the things in this room, right, without language. And in fact, many sort of affective architects in like the 1990s tried to strip architecture of language so that we could have an immediate kind of formal experience of it without language, something that I would argue is ultimately impossible. So both of these writers are extremely interesting to me, but they also represent something that is a kind of typical description of writing and buildings, which is they're really talking about writing that is about architecture, writing that describes, historicizes, theorizes, or criticizes buildings, cities, and environments. And like them, I'm interested in that, but I'm also interested in practices from history and practices that I can develop that confuse the boundaries between those things that we understand as discrete spheres, representations that are images and representations that are words. And I thought that this, as I was beginning to explore this idea or the history of this, I always thought that this must be a very recent concern. I can think of contemporary people and show you contemporary people that have blurred language and architecture. But I was surprised that it goes back to this very time, or even earlier, actually. So another historian named Mario Carpo, and others, he's not unique in this, reveal that practices that confused or mixed text and image are actually found at the very origins of architecture theory itself. So this is an image of a manuscript of Leon Battista Alberti's book on books on architecture, and it includes a description in Latin, I don't know if any of you can read Latin, about how the profile of a column pedestal, a classical column pedestal, could be represented with the letters C, L, and S. And Alberti's books were written in manuscript form. That means they were copied by hand by other people. And he didn't use this way, this technique of describing how you can have an image in your mind of architecture for conceptual reasons. He was doing this for practical reasons, because in manuscript transcription, what would happen is if you had a drawing, you had to rely on the drawing skill of the copyist to make the drawing accurate. And often you would have a copyist who could write language beautifully, but couldn't, as we say in English, draw for shit. So so you would have a terrible drawing of your original drawing. So by using the letters C, L, and S, he would have a guarantee, in this particular case, he would have a guarantee that he would have an accurate description of what he was talking about. And so here's how that works. The letter S, the letter C, and the letter L form the profile of this particular architectural column. So if you put on your seatbelts and we move forward 500 years, okay, we don't have enough time to talk about 500 years of architecture writing experiments, we can find practices that far more willfully mix the boundaries or confuse the boundaries between text and images, and are really not about practical considerations at all. So these more recent experiments emerge from various conceptual and critical approaches to architectural representation. This is one of the famous, I'm sure some of you have seen this, this is one of the famous quote-unquote typed plans made by the Archizoom group to represent their vision of the city reduced to a quantifiable and unending form they call the no-stop city, something that has obviously very much come back in architectural fashion. There's so much writing about this project and these images these days. So the author of these particular images was a man named Massimo Morozzi, one of the group, and he was actually using a typewriter to represent what you see in these images here, the kind of text image that inspired him and was actually developed in geographical quantification technologies from the late 1960s, the first forms of remote sensing and GIS. So the image on the left is from 1968 and is by an American California-based geographer named Robert Caldwell, who used computers to digitize analog images of landscapes into quantifiable data about their resources, lumber, water, et cetera. Each of the letters that you see on the bottom represents something in the photograph that's a different type of resource. And in this way, they could quantify, like in theory, the types or amounts of resources in a particular kind of place. This was originally published in an American in the American magazine Scientific American. It was republished in Italian the same year. Morozzi saw it. Morozzi copied the idea for his thing, and it involved if any of you are historians in the room, it involved one of the most intense sort of almost like private investigations I ever had to undertake as a historian to find the origins of this particular image. It was kind of crazy. Okay, so the Arc-A-Zoom plan was meant to suggest the possibility of reducing the city to very similar kinds of visual data units. But what's key here is that it also related to contemporary concrete poetry experiments, particularly those of Ilse and Pierre Garnier, who wrote a book of concrete poetry in the 1960s called Texts for Architecture. And you can really see how Morozzi's pulling from concrete poetry, pulling from American forms of computerized data visualization to create very much an aesthetic representation of landscape and city. So other architects exploring the text image were less influenced by computational imagery, ironically enough, and more influenced by experimental literature and conceptual art. So this is a fairly well-known text image by Peter Eisenman from his seminal piece of architectural theory called Notes on Conceptual Architecture, in which he took a pre-existing text of his own and he removed all of the content from the text and just left the footnotes, leaving something that kind of looks like a floor plan. And the text, it's a multi-page work, you're just looking at a few pages. And the text was inspired also by concrete poetry, also, and by the Fluxus movement and language art from the mid-1960s. And Eisenman, who's is this coming through? Okay. Sometimes because of the resolution of projectors, you can't see some of the subtleties in text. So Eisenman's very interested in this idea of what he calls the index, the sense of something that's not there. And he leaves an index of the original text that he made, creating this kind of floor plan-like thing. And so this also is, I would argue, a representation of architecture that's kind of constituted from characters, from alphanumerical characters, like what you have on a keyboard. And it's also related to ideas from mail art, actually. And at the end of the essay, Eisenman said, if you'd actually like to read the essay that I erased in this publication, just send me a letter, and I'll mail you back a regular normal copy that's actually you can read. And there's no record of any request that anybody ever made for that particular essay. So maybe some of you know this image. These are, by the way, all of these images are from roughly the same time, between 1968 and 1972. Several are right in 1972. 1972 seems to be a very important year in experiments in text and architecture. Okay, so anybody know what this is from? Since I feel like I'm in a teaching hall, so I should act like a teacher. Anybody guess where this is from? Well, okay. Anybody that's under 40 know where this is from? Sorry, maybe you're 39. I apologize. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No? Okay. It's from Learning from Las Vegas. Yes. So this was drawn by two students, or written. That's always interesting to think about the words you use. This was written by two students of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown in the Learning from Las Vegas studio at Yale. This is named Ron Filson and Martha Wagner. And they took text from signs in Las Vegas and create a kind of diagrammatic plan of their relationships based on size and position. And they too were interested in contemporary poetical experiments and kind of created a series of sentences out of the signs that are sort of funny and absurd and comment about the way language comes together in Las Vegas Strip. So these are all quotes from various signs. Welcome to fabulous Las Vegas. Free aspirin. Ask us anything. Vacancy gas. Right? It's a kind of strange sentence. So one of the things I just want to mention quickly, and I'll try to move a little bit more quickly, in looking at all of this, is that architects are looking at poetry very intensely. And this is something that I think has been lost a bit. I'm going to show you examples all the way, very quickly, all the way up to recent times. But as I was exploring this, I became more and more interested in poetry, because why not? Why do we turn to history, theory, criticism only, or journalism? Why not turn to like poetical experiments to think about the way that language and architecture can come together? And I love the fact that I was invited to Austria, because one of the big discoveries about this was that one of your nation's most famous architectural historians, Friedrich Achleitner, whose name I probably just butchered, was also a very important concrete poet in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a member of the Wiener Gruppe, who was one of two members who were exploring how architecture representation and writing could come together to form a new type of experimental poetical form. So Achleitner wrote this book called Quadratroman, Square Novel, which some of you may know, in which it's filled with things that refer to directions and space that's all set within this square that's kept static throughout the book, and the language is kind of moving around the page. And one of the reasons that I'm in Austria is that I would like to interview Achleitner. He's 85 years old right now, and he told me before we had the interview that there's just one thing I needed to know, that literature was his love and architecture was his, I want to think of a polite way to put this, let's just say, a little bit more difficult, right? And that literature was something that was a little more pleasant to be involved with. Architecture involves a little bit more torture. Okay, so the poet on the right, the poem on the right, also a kind of mixture of architecture representation and concrete poetry ideas, is by Ernst Jandl, and it's called Seance. And you're supposed to read the U in German, which I guess you say ooh, as if a seance is occurring in the space of the page itself and also representing people sitting around the table. So obviously not the most sophisticated spatial ideas in this, but completely fascinating that this kind of work was being staged. Okay. So, and this is not just limited to the 1960s. The text, image, and architecture never completely disappears, although certain forms of drawings, we find less and less explicit examples of it as we enter various digital realms. So more recent works exist by architects that willfully extend ideas in that earlier Italian and Viennese work, such as these drawings by Daniel Liebeskind and Rem Koolhaas. The one on the left is very much inspired by Kurt Schwitter's writing, and is for a project that he was working on in Austria. And the image on the right by OMA is from their urban revitalization project for La Défense in Paris, and it shows the ages of the buildings in each block, and he's going to then, or they're going to then cross out the dates of certain eras or time periods that they want to eliminate from the contemporary space of the city. Okay, so to wrap up this preliminary definition on writing experiments and architecture, I also want to mention that I've been leading workshops on this with guests from the realms of literature at various schools of architecture. And it's really interesting when you demand of students that they're no longer allowed to draw for the week. And nor can they act as graphic designers. They're completely limited to the characters on the keyboard. They're completely limited to one font. And they have to figure out a way to develop a program for architectural representation that involves something that we would call writing, but creating images of something or language about something that we would call architecture, nor can it be descriptive. And so these are very fun, all kinds of experiments with Unicode that really blur, with characters that really blur the relationships between what we call a piece of writing and what we would call a drawing. Okay, so, and related to various forms of content. Okay, so maybe that's a not so subtle way of suggesting if you'd like to bring me back to lead one of these workshops, that would be fun to do. Okay, so in my own professional work as a historian, theorist, and critic, I've recently asked how the text that I make can conceptually connect to the built environment as well. So my métier, my work, is not one, and I don't make plans and sections. As I mentioned, I'm a writer. I look at these things, I can foster such things, but I'm beholden to other forms: papers, essays, books, speeches, lectures. So I want to introduce or share a series of 3 text works of my own with you that relate at some conceptual level to these earlier works, but that ultimately deal with more historical and analytical problems and questions. So, as I mentioned before, I like to call these works environmental translations, and what I imagine that to mean is that in this particular case, they're translations of existing texts, of existing publications or language, into representations of specific spaces and environments. And it's kind of fun to be giving a very English language-oriented lecture in a German language school, because I want to focus first on this very text-oriented word, which is translation. Okay, so when I use the word translation, that's our president, in case you didn't know that. When I use the word translation, I'm talking about that activity that involves taking a pre-existing language and moving it into some other system of representation. So you can obviously translate a text from English to Spanish, Russian or Chinese, as these translators working for the UN are doing. You can translate a text from text to semaphore, speech to sign language, as it's having with Obama, and on and on and on. Now, it sounds fairly obvious how to translate something, okay? But one of the great theorizers of the act of translation, whose name I have to correctly pronounce tonight, Walter Benjamin, German cultural critic, right, who you all know, who lived from 1892 to 1940, argued that things were not so simple, okay? Benjamin argued that translation was actually a creative process that was less about communicating the meaning of an original text and more about enabling the original untranslated text to transform language itself, to transform English, to transform German or Russian, all in an effort to capture the relevant experience of reading the original. So Benjamin proclaims that the task of translation is not some kind of direct, unmediated form of communication, and he argued that even the most simple act of translation is fraught with danger. In his famous essay on the task of the translator, he argues about how difficult it is to translate the word bread from French, pain, into German, Brot. And he says, for a French speaker, if you say pain, you imagine something white and fluffy on the inside and crust, like a baguette. And if you say Brot to the German speaker, and this is very funny giving this talk here, but here we go, is you obviously imagine something a bit darker, little, maybe slightly less crusty. And I know it's around dinner time, so I'm probably making you all very hungry, but you get the point. Something darker and harder versus light and fluffy, I guess is how you would put it. So bad translations, Benjamin writes, just communicate the same words in a different language without translating what he calls mystification, difference, opacity of experience that often accompanies language. He said great translations transform all language and enable us to type into a kind of universal character of all languages. Like a beautiful idea, a little bit hard to understand, but it's one that you probably know very well. In English, at least, one of the key examples that I think one could use to explain Benjamin's idea is the translations of the Hebrew, Coptic, and Latin Bible. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I'm completely fascinated by the kinds of efforts to translate the Bible. So this translation in 1611 of the Hebrew, Coptic, and Latin Bible into English completely transformed English itself and gave us the kind of sense of grandeur of biblical speech. It's the endless like thous and thee and the kind of famous lines within the work. It's opening lines. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth are so key to sort of understanding an image of the relationship between heaven and earth. And many of the lines in 1611 translation are actually improvements on earlier translations, like really botched translations. For example, there's a Psalm 23, which is often read at funerals. Begins, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." You've probably read it or seen it in many films. Is a good translation of an earlier and much less gifted translation, which is, "The Lord shepherds me and I want none." Or consider that other Bible, the German Communist Manifesto, okay, which is in its second English translation gave English a sense of Marxist phrasing. So its famous opening lines in German, which I'm gonna butcher, "Ein Gespenst," did I get that right? "Geht in Europa das Gespenst des Kommunismus." Okay? Yeah, okay. So the opening lines of the second English translation of that are, a specter haunts Europe, the specter of communism. But that was actually not the first translation. The first absolutely horrible translation begins, a frightful hobgoblin stalks throughout Europe. Okay, so in one version, communism is this kind of apparition, a kind of spirit, a ghost, and in another, a beast, right, that is tromping throughout the continent, right? It's very strange, okay. So translations also occur within one language, as strange as that is to sound, as in the work of transcription, which was a commonplace, particularly before mechanical reproduction of sound. So for example, those of you that aren't recording my talk, that are writing it down, you can very easily write things that I would argue are different than what I actually said. Transcription is a form of translation of spoken word to written word. So I apologize again if you're not familiar with these texts, and I doubly apologized if, of course, you're familiar with these texts, and I would even think that you're not. But one of the most famous kind of written monuments in American English is a speech that was given by President Abraham Lincoln at a cemetery that was dedicated to dead soldiers of the Civil War at Gettysburg. It's called the Gettysburg Address. And there's actually this is like one of the most important pieces of writing in American English. And there's over 6 different versions of what people thought they heard that day. And one that was ultimately decided that, okay, yeah, that's the Gettysburg Address. But there are many, many versions. Lincoln's own hometown newspaper, hated the speech that he was given. I thought it was so full of fancy talk, as they called it, that they translated it into a familiar language that its readers can understand, which begins, so the Gettysburg Address begins 407 years ago. It's very famous in English. And in the Centralia version begins, 90 years ago, our fathers formed a government consecrated to freedom. So it lacks the grandeur of what we think Lincoln actually said, and it attempts to communicate language without a strong sense of authorship. Okay, so although many of these represent Benjamin's ideas, they're still burdened with ideas of communication. And a few writers and artists, beginning again in the late 1960s, have taken Benjamin's more conceptual understanding of translation to heart and created what we call translations, in quotes, that emphasize the transformation of language into particular social and cultural realities. And this is one of my favorite examples of this. So what you're looking at is a text called What We Workers Want, which I can't pronounce properly in Yorkshire. But it's a text by the poet Steve McCaffrey that translates the the English version of the Communist Manifesto, of Marx's Communist Manifesto, into a working class Yorkshire dialect, okay? And this, which makes you think of ideas of speech, class, and politics wrapped up within language. And this was useful to me because it suggests how translation can begin to represent geographical realities through particular forms of speech. There's a recording of it that you can Google online. It's hilarious, moving, and a tremendous piece of poetry all at the same time. So another example by the artist Zhang Yushen is her translation of translation in quotes, of the Communist Manifesto into Mandarin, but she places the text into an indeterminate state between languages. As a bilingual speaker, it's not English, it's not Chinese, but it's operating somewhere in between, which was a kind of space that she wanted to open to the translator. Okay, so these more conceptual translations are translations situated within the difference of languages. But what would environmental or spatial, I guess we could say, translation mean? Okay, so reading or listening is not always in a particular language, but happens somewhere at some time. Language is conditional on culture and geography, of course, but it's also conditional on things more familiar to all of you in this room, which is the specificity of space and environment. So as Benjamin warns, we need to understand the frictions within forms of communication as lending language a particular character of time. That was his focus, time. But we could also say that it lends language a particular character of space, which is to say, in a very simple way, that language is always somewhere at some historical moment in some space. And this makes language, even the same printed or spoken word, always a site of constant flux and mutation. A speech I give in this room is different than a speech I give in another room. A question you ask in this room is different than a question you would ask outside or anywhere else. Okay. For example, modern forms of reading in the West begin under candlelight in the 17th century. It begins with reading mass-distributed texts such as English, German, and French translations of the Bible by candle. Okay? Georges de Latour, who's a painter you're looking at here from the 17th century, represented the aspect of this world. He was representing something very modern, actually, even though these paintings look so archaic. Reading at night, in the absolute darkness of night, that was like an enlightenment possibility, right? And like Vermeer, Latour is one of these painters that's studied by scientists for the unusual quality of light that is so alien to us today, this kind of incredible darkness as much as light that we're seeing in the painting. Anyway, but what all these paintings are actually painting of are people reading the Bible under candlelight. This is one of the first mass-distributed texts, translations of the Bible, the kind of experience of reading at night, being a very modern one. But one, obviously, to our eyes now is very unmodern and frankly is fairly unmodern in a way I'll demonstrate in a second. So I want to make a few rhetorical points. So here's a picture of the King James Bible, a translation of the Bible at night, but photographed today, okay? And at night, the text would never have looked like this in the 17th century because there was no strong and even electrical light like today. And when you Google, it's always funny to talk about what you Google, right? But when you Google candlelight Bible, as I was beginning to think about this idea, most of this research wasn't done by Google, by the way. I just want to tell you that. Okay, I found this movie that somebody posted on YouTube of the Bible under candlelight, which I thought was kind of hilarious. So somebody who must be very religious made this kind of experience for us to feel the glow of God. All right, so you can make a rendering. Here is a tool that basically demonstrates the amount of light given off by a candle at a certain distance, so you see the darkness. But I wanted to make a translation, okay? So there's a German scientific text from the 19th century by an American, actually, James Cattell, that examines how people misidentify black letter text. That's the kind of, it's the kind of text that was in the first printing press, and for us, most Americans know it because it's the text of the masthead of the New York Times. And he's talking about how poor this text is and trying to make an argument to move away from this text. And he's using scientific studies and an apparatus that he created to study how people identify, or in his case, misidentify black letter text under the kinds of reduced lighting that one would find from candles or the dark at dusk or dawn. And the letter confusions are actually having a friend translate his text, reading my friend's translation of the text. The letter confusions are actually very different than those that occur with the Roman alphabet. All of you in the room have probably taken an eye test, so you're familiar with those. And they're particular to black letter. So an A will often resemble an N or an O. A D can take the appearance of an H, a B, or an O. That's black letter on the right, obviously. I can look like T or F, and an N often looks like a Y. And I looked at the Y on the bottom right, to me, that looks like an N to begin with. It's amazing that anybody would ever think that was an N. So using this study from 150 years ago, we can create an algorithm. I create an algorithm program based on these confusions and their probabilities that can simulate the appearance of the letters of the King James Bible under dimming candlelight on a moonless night with no exterior ambient light at all. That's the title of the essay at first. Something that we rarely experience today, but such spaces were quite common in the 17th century. So I'm going to show you a fragment of my translation of the King James Bible, translated into a dark room on a moonless night, lit by a dimming candle in the 17th century. And it was just actually commissioned by this fantastic new literary journal that I want to encourage all of you to write for, to submit to, called 45, which is very interested in what maybe all this work represents, and I think many people realize, is that architecture is experiencing a furious kind of literary turn at the moment, which is fantastic, a move away from a kind of certain type of objective project, although in my case, my work uses a lot of science, towards something that turns towards literature as a source of friction or experience in architecture. Okay, or imagination, which is a strange word to use, but probably puts things correctly. Okay, so if you read it slowly, your mind will adjust a bit and it becomes more legible. But as James Cattell noticed, the kind of science behind this works in the dark. If you read this in the dark with a candle, it becomes more legible because these processes of how we perceive things always work and result in reverse as well. You're looking at the chapter of Genesis through this algorithm and actually through a kind of gradient getting worse and worse as I imagine the candle would dim in this dark room and the letter confusions start to be intensify. Here it is towards the end, and it almost completely falls apart in terms of legibility. But again, if you look at it in dark, I don't even know how you do this with a projector, but if you look at download it on 45 and look at it in the dark, it's fascinating. And that's also it's a fun thing to read. So an early environmental translation. So also, if you look at it in Roman alphabet, if I said it in Roman alphabet, which I would never do for a publication, it makes the unusual spellings of the work that much more obvious. Okay, so if the environment of a room historically gets in the way of reading, we probably more easily understand how environments and spaces get in the way of listening. Okay, it's the foundation of acoustical science, which I'm sure is something that you've all studied briefly, the notion that space mutates the perception of sound. So you're looking at another chart from science, that measures the audibility of certain sounds that are common in English. I'm sure there's a similar chart for German. Ooh is one of the most legible sounds to carry across distance. So if I were to use all ooh words, I probably wouldn't need the microphone, and everybody in the background would hear me well. J, v. So I'm very inspired by performance poetry, and th are some of the less audible because of their high frequency. So if I were to speak in a j, lecture, we would need plenty of amplification because those sounds simply don't carry. So if you've ever noticed when your door is shut in your office or something, and if you have a friend with a very deep voice, you'll notice there's no way you can block out that person's sound, right? I have a neighbor with a very deep voice, and it's extraordinarily annoying because no amount of noise cancellation can cancel an extremely low frequency wave because it's just not possible. They can literally move through walls because they have so much energy. Okay, or actually so little energy that they can't be blocked, as the case may be. Okay, so at a distance or in a noisy room or if you have bad hearing, the word south might sound like ow, south, ow. And it is true, it works. This is because we tend also to mishear and rhyme. As we get older and lose our hearing ability, it's a bit depressing, but we begin to hear more and more like poets because we're always hearing in rhyme. So if any of you know the American show The Simpsons, there's a constant gag in which Grandpa, the character, is mishearing things in rhyme, and he always hears the most obscene things that people say, even though what they're saying is completely, genteel, right? But it's like a kind of gag that the old person is constantly hearing, these very strange kind of dirty kinds of language when everything everybody's saying is completely normal. Okay, so Andrew Nevins, who's a scientist at University College London, argues that mishearings have the capacity to transform language over time. So for example, an apron, is this thing that people used to wear around their necks, that long cloth when they were cooking to keep themselves from getting dirty. That is the original English word, apron. And over time, due to the way that we hear, a apron became an apron, which is this thing, it's the very same thing. And so, there's multiple examples that Nevin gives of this phenomena, but as we hear in space, language itself transforms. Okay, so as I mentioned in my earlier discussion of transcription, the Gettysburg Address is a great document to consider the instability of language because it in and of itself is unstable because there's so many versions of it and it exists through so many different spaces and geographies. Okay, it also is useful because it satisfies the definition of something called canned language, which is a term that the Oulipo group of French poets used to describe language that everybody knows and that can therefore be manipulated in poetical experiments, so canned language. So they, when they were working in English, which they rarely did, they used the Shakespearean line to be or not to be to represent all kinds of different various kinds of structural poetic experiments that they would do, where they'd rearrange letters or mix up language based upon a series of what they called restrictions. So in American English, the Gettysburg Address is canned language. Everybody knows it. When I give this talk in America, everyone's says to me, I had to memorize that in high school, so it's a thing that people know. Okay, so anyway, so its opening lines 7 years ago put through this kind of science of how we hear at a distance could sound like the following. And I don't want to suggest that this is what you hear. This is one of many, many possibilities. Of course, and every year I go, right? Or at 100 feet or at 175 feet, it could sound like this, according even a go. And when I'm working with these projects, I use tools called impulse responses and convolution reverb, which are algorithms that can simulate certain spaces and distances just to verify how I am actually experiencing these things, even as I ultimately use algorithmic tools or other forms of direct forms of transcription, just to verify these things. Okay, so the potential of language to bend and mutate environments is completely infinite. So we can look at one version of the Gettysburg Address, target the sounds that would be difficult to hear, study 19th century speech, and perhaps develop something like this, which is my first attempt at translating a historic speech into a specific distance of inaudibility. So a translation into space and inaudibility. And the trick is reproducing the disorienting effects of missing words, mishearing and rhyme, and general unintelligibility without resorting to a purely kind of historicist form of language. Let me explain that. So when you watch an American language film and they want to suggest that the language is older, what do? The people start speaking in British accents, right? So if you watch Troy, or any other movie about, or anything about that's set in the past, it's British accents. That's ancient. Okay, so we don't want to do it that way. Okay, I don't know how that convention came about. We want to do it this way, which is something else. But you also have to realize this is a dedication to funeral. So the language has to have a sense of loss behind it as well. People know that they're there not to hear a pep speech about making money in corporate America in the 19th century. They're there to hear a funeral oration. So how do you convey loss and mishearing? It's very interesting to me how that possibility. I'm not going to read this to you now, just to keep things moving along. Okay, so I want to end with one more environmental translation. It's contemporary. Okay, it's more about the present, and then it has a more ethical and political dimension. It was actually the breakthrough project in all of this. It was a commission from the Harvard Design Magazine, which is like historically one of the more conservative architecture magazines. And I told them that I'm really like playing around with ideas about language and architecture, and I want to do this. And they have a great new editor named Jennifer Siegel, and she was like, just go for it. We'll just see what happens, and I'm sure it'll work out, which is great. It's always great to work with brave editors. Absolutely key to making all of this kind of work possible. Okay, so you're looking at an image of a smoggy sky in Los Angeles. And this is a type of experience I've personally written a lot about in various articles and books, and the things that Stefano was mentioning. The experience of pollution, I would argue, is one of the key ways in which you experience modernity in a city, right? So reflections on LA's polluted sky in particular produce some very powerful works of art, such as this artist book by Bruce Nauman called LA Air. Bruce Nauman basically laid on his back with a 2.25 camera and photographed the color of the sky in LA. Okay, and if you ask a child what color the sky is, they don't say yellow and orange. Here's some other spreads from the book. They don't say orange and black, right? They say blue. Okay, but it's a way for him to portray an aspect of the polluted environment in Los Angeles. And by the way, today, the sky in Los Angeles is considerably better, but the improvement of the pollution in the air in Los Angeles hasn't been like a smooth arc of improvement. It actually, in the 1980s, right around when they hosted the Olympics, it was horrible again, absolutely much worse than it was in the late 70s. And now it's a little bit better again, but it goes kind of like this. It doesn't go like this in terms of the breathability of the air. And it's important to realize that the air in Los Angeles could once again become polluted again, as hard as that is imagined, as the climate changes, as automobility changes. Okay, as the city continues to expand. Ed Ruscha is a very critical person in representation. The painter, Ed Ruscha, is very critical artist in terms of portraying nature in Los Angeles. This is his painting of the Hollywood sign. And he often painted the sign with the kind of fantastical orange sky that accompanied it because of pollution in Los Angeles. And Ruscha wrote when the Hollywood sign was he often couldn't see the sign itself from his studio, and that he would paint it when it was visible. For him, he said his paintings were barometers of the very visibility of the sign itself. Okay, so I was very interested in the kind of history of representing pollution in Los Angeles, interested in Rouchet and Naumann, and very interested in what I didn't yet call an environmental translation, but this idea of how could, my limitation to the 26 letters of American English do something similar, make a kind of metaphysical, conceptual representation of pollution. And so I turned to the sign itself, and there's a whole of thinking about how to represent the sign. So there's a whole genre of photos on Flickr of people photographing the sign when it can't be seen or can barely be seen. So here's one of hundreds of photos. And it's somewhat ironic that the most famous built icon in Los Angeles, this is essentially the Eiffel Tower, right, of Los Angeles, is hard to see. It is the most famous built work. If we think of buildings, a built environment, it is the most well-known built work in Los Angeles. This image has a very interesting caption. It says, "The infamous LA smog. I didn't even realize the Hollywood sign was there until I'd been there an hour." Oh, and this photo is not in black and white. It's a color photo, if you can believe it. And you can see it was taken, 7 years ago, so not from the 70s. Here's another photo of the Hollywood sign. Someone trying to be ironic. There's a whole, I could show you these for hours from an airplane. Here's another. Here's one from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art where Ed Ruscha's painting of the Hollywood sign is held. So you can go up to the roof and look at the Hollywood sign and go down in the galleries and look at the Hollywood sign as well. Okay, so the language of the Hollywood sign is stable for Rouchet. But for me, the language of the sign and it is kind of unstable. And is key for me in developing a written representation of the experience of smog, and in particular the smog in Los Angeles. So you all know how the Hollywood sign is spelled, right? HOLLYWOOD, right? Like this, okay. But that's not how the letters appear in the smog and at a distance. To my eyes, when I look at this, again, you will all see this differently. That looks like this, NDLLVVOQD. Now if I take that smoggy spelling, let's call it a smoggy spelling, okay, and set it against a smoggish gray background, it's a little big in here, and put it in a distance, so it's like in the distance, it will look more like the correct spelling of Hollywood. Those of you in the back will likely see Hollywood. You will not see NDLLVVOQD. This is one of the most common appearances of, if not the most common ways that the letters of the Hollywood sign appear, again, to me, in the hazy air of Los Angeles. And again, if I do like this, it will come together in your mind when set against a gray background with tiny type. You see Hollywood, you don't see what I just said. So what you're experiencing is seeing and experiencing in the photographs and re-simulated in my transcriptions or translations are effects caused by contrast, what's called contrast reduction. So the particulates in the air, the ozone and hydrocarbons, reflect light and make foreground objects lose their distinction relative to backgrounds. There's actually a test to measure how we misperceive text and reduce contrast. It's called the Pele-Robson visual acuity test. This is something that you have to be much older before they start giving this to you. This is not a test to test how you read in smog. This is because when you get older, it's very hard to see it's harder to see the distinction between black type and a white page. It starts to lose its contrast, and it's a way to measure your sensitivity or your inability to see contrast. So, believe it or not, I hate to say this to everybody in the room over 40, but there's 7 lines on this test, and those of you that are under 40 can probably read 6. Those of you is anybody here under 20? You can definitely read all 7. Those of you at 30, well, it also depends on some of you can only read 2. It also depends on the sensitivity of the projector, right? Yeah, all right, yeah, you're screwed. Sorry. Right, I know, I'm not an ophthalmologist, so if you can't see it, call your doctor. Right, okay, right. You didn't know, I told you some of my friends think I've lost my mind, but I'm very happy right now. Okay, so there's other tests that measure the perception of text when it loses its distinctions from its backgrounds. Here's another one that's more about like reading text in print, which becomes smudgy sometimes, not lately with laser printing, but in the past. And again, just like that project about translating into candlelight, there are tables that suggest the probability of most of us human beings, what kind of ways that we'll missee letters in reduced contrast. Okay, so very similar to the kind of black letter misidentification, but dealing with Roman letters here. So again, I turn to the algorithm, and I use this information to write a script that would output the appearance of the Hollywood sign at various levels of smogginess and distances. You guys are still thinking about that eye test. You're fine, it's the projector, Okay, so H will often look like N, K, or U. The O's will often look like D's, among other letters. The Y's look like V's, et cetera, et cetera. As hard as it is to imagine, there are potentially over 1 million different ways the Hollywood sign can appear in the smog and at a distance. And for me, what's fascinating about this is that there's variations, not infinite, but literally hundreds of thousands of variations, enable me as a writer to have the capacity to represent a type of scale and appearance of reading as an urban phenomena, okay? So there are potentially, so many different ways that people that live throughout this city and travel throughout the city or visit the city can see. And literature, as you know, you all read, of course, literature. Literature is all about enabling a shift of perspective from one person to another. It's a core aspect of fiction, of poetry. And for me, these extracts, or my ability to begin to represent the smog, makes you begin to think about how somebody might see it other than you. So this text exists in a many thousand word version, but there's more manageable ones. Okay, it exists in a 5,000 word version, a 25,000 word version. There is a 100,000 word version. Most people don't want to publish that one. These are extracts of the 5,000 word version, organized from the most to the least legible. Okay, so these are just different pages in that. This is page 20. Here's page 25. This is page 60, where it almost completely begins to lose its 165, sorry. And my computer is a little, or my ability to see is a little bit difficult, but I like to read a little bit of it because it's language, right? So, and you can laugh. It's okay. It's sad and funny. So upalivapu, ubilibuk, ebubup. You can laugh. It's fine. It's fine. Poetry should be funny. A language should be funny. Architecture should be funny. Ubliup, Fuldivrak, Epivaku, Uriduptu. I won't read the whole thing. Krivu, that one's easy. Ooh, this one's a little nasty. FQ. Okay. Fikurber. All right. Ubilubu, Fuldabuk, Kudavu. All right, you get the idea. Okay. So again, the journal that commissioned this bit of experimental writing for me, the Harvard Design Magazine, they really only wanted to publish about 20 words of this thing, 30 words of this thing, but it was really great of them to do it. So I was very interested. I refuse to be involved in the graphic design of these, right? Because it's a work of writing. For me, it's not graphic design. I give you the letters, and you do as you wish. Just don't do anything like cheesy, like set it to make it actually look like the Hollywood sign. Okay, so. What was interesting to me is that they originally wanted to set it in a gray background, so that when you held it at reading distance, you wouldn't even realize that there were any misspellings at all, and that it was only from reading the description at the bottom that you would begin to even look up and think like, that's not the word Hollywood, that's something else. But they ultimately set it in this kind of eye chart type thing. This is another version of the text that's actually going to be released at some event that Columbia is doing at the Venice Biennale for a book they're doing called Climates. This is the afterword of the book is my smoggy Hollywood text. I'm very excited about that. There's a 3,000 word version they published. Here's a version a fantastic Los Angeles, San Francisco-based graphic designer Jean Sueda created for the exhibition of the text that was in Los Angeles recently. This is an exhibition of the text. I have to admit, here's some guys trying to read smoggy Hollywood. It works much better as a PDF than as something that hangs on a gallery wall. That's something that has to be thought about. People aren't used to reading standing up. I think that's the issue. We don't read standing up. The only thing that you read standing up are monuments. I'm becoming more convinced about this, right? Or I guess if you're a pedestrian, street signs. Everything else we read sitting. Okay, so let me wrap this all up. It's been about an hour now. I've shown you 3 different text forms from 3 different epochs: a 17th century book, a 19th century speech, and a 20th century sign, all of which have been translated into spaces and environments tied to their histories. So what does all this work suggest? I mean, for me, it suggests certain things. It can, it can suggest many things, but here are some general points to consider. The relationship between language, spaces, and environments is inherently unstable, complex, and a potential site of creative production and representation. Another point, the comprehension of language, of all language, reading, listening, has an underexplored spatial and environmental history. When that Candlelight text was published, the editors of the journal invited this really, I think, fantastic historian of print named Adrian Johns to write what he thought. He's a historian of early print publications in English in particular, to write about what he thought of the translation I had done. And he said we don't. He said after reading it, he said he realized there's no environmental history of reading. That just doesn't exist, and that's something. Not that I'm interested in necessarily doing that, but a work like that can begin to suggest what that might be. Okay, so to comprehend language, whether it's spoken or written in one time in one place, is very different than another time in another place. Again, this can be the site for fantastical forms of writing, or just the very simple basis of acoustic and lighting studies. Okay, space and language have a historical and contemporary relationship that is ultimately transformative of the experience of language. And then finally, the understanding of this relationship can also transform the future imagined of spaces and environments, as well as their future histories. And what I mean by that is that when people were one editor in particular was publishing the Hollywood text, this particular editor said to me, I want to have someone, or she said, actually, maybe you could, or someone could think about how we could make text more legible in these difficult environments. How could you make text more legible in the smog? And I said to her, the point of the Hollywood text is not to develop a more legible way to read in the smog. The point of the Hollywood text is to imagine the ending of people's experience of smog, or the tragedy of people's experience of smog, and imagining a Los Angeles that have a different kind of sky and a different kind of environment, not to optimize as the designer might imagine something else. Okay, so that's a good point to end, and thank you for letting me share this work with you. Yeah.